We're back. Lecture 13. Do we possess free will? The question of the week. Just to remind you, I posted the chat with Sharon Street in Lecture 12. Do have a look at that if you get the chance. Remember Aaron Hernandez, all the way back from the first lecture in 2012. He was a player for the Patriots, and a little while later he was arrested for the murder of a linebacker called Odin Lloyd. He was convicted of murdering Lloyd in 2015 and committed suicide in a Massachusetts prison in 2017. He was only 27. And it turned out that he had brain damage on autopsy caused by his football career. And that, we think, tends to get him off the hook, as this doctor said. I quoted this in Lecture 1. He wasn't an evil man. No, he wasn't. He was a sick man. His actions were due, or largely due, or significantly due, to factors over which Hernandez had no control. He still did a terrible thing, committing that murder, but his neural condition absolves him, it's natural to think, of responsibility. We're about to see some arguments that this is just an especially clear case of someone acting without free will, and so with no moral responsibility. On closer scrutiny, it turns out that we are no better off in the free will department than Aaron Hernandez. Remember Anthony on the free will defense against the problem of evil as an argument against the existence of God. According to this line of thought, Anthony writes, free will is something of surpassingly important moral value. But in order for God to create beings with free will, he must refrain from interfering with the actions they freely choose to perform. Of course, human beings many times choose to do things that cause suffering. God cannot prevent this suffering, because to do so, he would have to ensure that we choose one way rather than another, and that would be the same as revoking our free will. So God has no choice in this matter. There is no possible situation in which God both grants us free will and ensures that we make good choices. So the point is that if you're to run the free will defense against the problem of evil, you have to think that if God ensured that we always chose the good, we always did the right thing, then God would have simultaneously ensured that we did not choose the right thing freely. God would have simultaneously ensured that we had no free will. Suppose that is the right way of thinking of free will. Then the worry is that if God could remove our free will by ensuring that we choose one way rather than another, then maybe the universe has already done that for him. Perhaps the universe ensures that we choose one way rather than another. And if God's doing that would revoke our free will, presumably the universe is doing that would also revoke our free will. We'll see how the universe might ensure that we do one thing rather than another at the end of the lecture. For now, I just want to make the point that scientists, interestingly enough, seem to be more skeptical about the existence of free will than philosophers. Charles Darwin is an example, going by what he said in some notebooks written in the early 19th century. And Sigmund Freud, whether or not he was an official skeptic, certainly gave us some materials to argue against the existence of free will. In the Psychopathology of Everyday Life, he makes some interesting observations. As is known, many persons argue against the assumption of an absolute psychic determinism by referring to an intense feeling of conviction that there is a free will. This feeling of conviction exists, but is not incompatible with the belief in determinism. This sort of argument for free will, namely that it's introspectively evident, is discussed in the introduction to the relevant chapter of the Norton Anthology. And now he makes an interesting observation that this feeling that you could do this thing or the other thing, it's entirely up to you, doesn't manifest itself in weighty and important decisions. On these occasions, one has much more the feeling of a psychic compulsion and gladly falls back on it. So in the case of, say, passing the drowning child in the pond, if you're some normal, decent human being, you won't have the feeling of being able to do one thing, namely save the drowning child, or another thing entirely, namely walk on by and go to your important business meeting. You'll feel compelled to jump in and save the child. And then Freud says, compare Luther's Here I stand, I cannot do anything else. That's the famous quote from the great 16th century German theologian Martin Luther, an important figure in the Protestant Reformation. Anyway, Freud goes on the other hand, it is in trivial and indifferent decisions that one feels sure that he could just as easily have acted differently, that he acted of his own free will and without any motives. So in relatively trivial choices, where nothing hugely weighty is at stake, it's those situations that we tend to feel that the future is completely open and it's entirely up to us whether we do one thing or the other. However, Freud says, or seems to be saying, this is just as much a case of being compelled to do one thing rather than the other, as in the first kind of case. From our analyses, we therefore need not contest the right of the feeling of conviction that there is a free will. If we distinguish conscious from unconscious motivation, we are then informed by the feeling of conviction that the conscious motivation does not extend over all our motor resolutions. What is thus left free from the one side receives its motive from the other side, from the unconscious. And the determinism in the psychic realm is thus carried out uninterruptedly. So you are determined to do one thing rather than another, even in a situation where the choice isn't a particularly weighty one. It's just that the determinants of your behavior are unconscious motives that you're not aware of. Anyway, let's see what Freud and Darwin, if we imagine them meeting up, have to say about free will.
Mr. Darwin, I see you've decided to begin the lifelong process of analysis as my patient. Did you decide to do so freely?
Yes, Dr. Freud, of course. No one put a gun to my head. It was a free choice. As a scientist myself, I was intrigued by your new science of the mind.
Why do you think you freely chose to come here?
Well, when I was deliberating about whether to come, I felt I could choose to or not. My choice wasn't determined in advance. I could have chosen not to come.
You are arguing against an absolute psychic determinism by referring to an intense feeling of conviction that there is a free will. But in my psychoanalytic theory, your conscious decision was the result of unconscious motives. There is determinism in the psychic realm, but it is not obvious to you because you are not aware of these unconscious motives.
But these unconscious motives are still my motives, correct?
They are, but in order for you to choose freely, you would have had to have chosen these unconscious motives. As Galen Strawson puts it, to be truly responsible for what you do, you must be truly responsible for the way you are.
But I can't be truly responsible for the way I am. If this argument is right, I'm a mere puppet with a... Good grief, what is that finger? You're being controlled by someone else's finger.
And that, of course, is the worry. That even though we feel that what we do is up to us in a way that makes us fully responsible for our actions, that's just an illusion. In fact, we're no more responsible for our actions than a puppet is. Freud, where's Freud? Here's Freud. Freud mentioned Galen Strawson. So let's have a look at Strawson's argument. Strawson starts by considering an ordinary choice situation, one in which you could either give $10 to charity or buy a cake with it. It seems clear to you, he says, that you are truly radically free to choose in such a way that you will be ultimately morally responsible for whatever you do choose. You can do one thing or the other. It is entirely up to you. Now, Strawson makes a connection between having free will, being able to choose freely, and being morally responsible for one's actions. True or ultimate responsibility, what other philosophers call moral responsibility, exists, Strawson says, if punishment and reward can be fair without having any sort of pragmatic justification, where a pragmatic justification is a justification for punishment or reward simply because it will prevent or encourage the behaviour in the future. It's fair to ask for an explanation of this talk of having free will, since we don't ordinarily go around saying that people have or don't have free will. All it means, at a first pass, is being free to choose. Being free to choose to do the thing or not to do the thing. And plausibly, unless we have free will, unless we're free to choose to buy the cake or not to buy the cake, we're not morally responsible for buying the cake or not buying the cake. Here's Strawson's basic argument, somewhat simplified. Suppose you chose the cake. You decided not to give the money to charity after all and bought the cake with your $10 bill. Well, why is that? Well, that's because you had certain, as Strawson calls them, principles of choice. You had certain preferences, values, and ideals. That's at least part of the explanation of why you chose the cake as opposed to giving the $10 to charity. Now, to be morally responsible for choosing the cake, you must be morally responsible for having these principles of choice, for having these preferences, values, and ideals. And, the argument continues, to be morally responsible for having P1, those principles of choice, you must have chosen them in a reasoned, conscious, intentional fashion. But choice is only possible against a background of certain principles of choice. If you had no preferences or values or ideals, then choice would be impossible. So choosing P1 requires having other preferences, values, and ideals. Call those P2. And again, you have to be morally responsible for having those. Well, once all that is granted, then we're obviously off on this infinite regress of principles, as Strawson says, and so on. Here we are setting out on a regress that we cannot stop. true or ultimate self-determination is impossible because it requires the actual completion of an infinite series of choices, of principles of choice. So true or ultimate moral responsibility is impossible because it requires true or ultimate self-determination. In other words, using a bit of Latin, Strawson says, we are not self-caused, not causa sui. According to him, that's the only way in which we can be morally responsible for our actions, by being self-caused. And because, again, according to him, it's impossible to be self-caused, ultimate moral responsibility is impossible. And whatever you think of Strawson's argument, the upshot, as he points out, is surely really disturbing. If one takes the notion of justice that is central to our intellectual and cultural tradition seriously, then the consequence of the basic argument is that there is a fundamental sense in which no punishment or reward is ever just. It is exactly as just to punish or reward people for their actions as it is to punish or reward them for the natural colour of their hair or the natural shape of their faces. So the consequences of this argument that we have no free will and so we are not morally responsible for our actions are profound. Now, Strawson's argument doesn't have as a premise anything from physics, but it's clearly related to what is perhaps the most widely discussed argument for the conclusion that we have no free will. And this argument does depart from a premise about the physical world. So determinism is the view that the state of the universe at any past time, together with the laws of nature, fix the state of the universe at any later time. So given some earlier state of the universe, S1, and the laws of nature, call them L, L and S1 entail that at some later time the universe is going to be in state S2. So if the universe is deterministic, that by itself is controversial and probably not at the moment known, but if the universe is deterministic, then the state of the universe, way before you were born, combined with the laws of nature, together entail that you're doing whatever it is you are actually doing, because they together entail that the universe is now in exactly the physical state that it's actually in. For more on this, see the introduction to chapter 13 in the Norton Anthology. Suppose that that's right. Suppose that the universe is deterministic. We'll discuss this argument in a bit more detail in the next lecture. Then this gives us another argument against free will. Suppose you chose the cake. Then your taking the cake was entirely determined by two factors, both of which were completely outside your control. One of those factors was the laws of nature that govern how the universe dynamically unfolds. And the other factor was some state of the universe that obtained long before, maybe billions of years before, you were even born. Those two factors, L and S1, together entail, in the logical sense, that you took the cake. You had nothing whatsoever to do with the laws of nature. You had nothing whatsoever to do with this prior state of the universe, S1, yet those things combined determined, guaranteed, that you took the cake. So how could you have chosen freely? To be continued next time. Charles, anything to say to the students?
Yes, thank you. Read Ayer and Chisholm for Wednesday.
We'll see you then.